Thank you, Dr. Namnat. And it's my honor to stand before you all today to give this Grand Rounds presentation. The title for my talk is From Novice to Expert, Is Talent Overrated? So the objectives of this talk are to describe the factors that are traditionally associated with expert performance, describe various models of expert performance, and then talk about what the research shows about expert performance, and then briefly just switch gears to a little bit more of the hard science in terms of looking at a new tool, thermal imaging, to measure performance. So these two men in this photograph here, on the left is pictured Jeff Immelt, and on the right is pictured Steve Ballmer. In 1978, these two men graduated from Harvard and Dartmouth respectively and joined Procter & Gamble, where their sole goal was to market Duncan Hines brownie mixes. Both of them actually were not very good at it, and towards the end of their training and their time over there, they were said to be the least likely to succeed. But as you well know, these two, before the age of 50, became the CEO of GE and Microsoft. So what happened? I mean, was it talent that took them to the top of their game? But if it was talent, what happened to the first 22 years where they were just like everybody else in their school who graduated? Was it experience? Nothing suggested that it was. And was it superior intelligence and memory? But if you look at their peers, they were just, average students, even though they graduated from Harvard and Dartmouth compared to their peers. So we'll examine a little more in detail what these factors, the traditional factors for expert performance, mean and what the research has shown to pan out. So when we say talent, we think of Tiger Woods. We think of Mozart over here, who was composing his first pieces at the age of 5 and having public performances at 8. Or we think of Garry Kasparov, who became a grandmaster at such a young age. But what is this talent? Is this something that's endowed gift? Is it something that's someone is born with, which is inspired? Well, the research doesn't completely pan that out, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail. And what is the role of experience? I think it's important to point out that experience is not expertise. There have been several studies, and this noted over here by Colin Kamer and Eric Johnson, about how experts can know so much and still perform badly. And basically, they looked at several professions. They looked at auditors and found that expert auditors, or not expert, but experienced auditors, could not predict corporate fraud any more than rookie auditors did. They found that clinical psychologists who were experienced did not predict personality disorders any more than rookies. Stockbrokers could not predict, experienced stockbrokers couldn't predict which stock was going to do well or bad. Parole officers couldn't predict what the chance of recidivism was in a patient or in a parolee. College admission officials who were experienced at analyzing numerous applications over years could not really differentiate, applicants based on their personality and based on what was on paper. And interestingly, they found among doctors that the ability to read x-rays, the ability to diagnose heart sounds, they actually go down with experience. And also they found that doctors who've had more training actually do poorer on tests of medical knowledge. So how does that correlate to what we know about experience and expertise? And the INSEAD School of Business in France, as well as the Naval Postgraduate Academy, talked about this as the experience trap. So what is the role of memory in expert performance? These numbers listed over here are part of an exercise called the digit span. And back in 1978, Professor William Chase, who's actually a Nobel laureate, and his fellow Anders Ericsson performed an experiment. So they gave several subjects this digit span, and the way that this test is administered is that numbers are sequentially read to a subject at 1 number a second. There's a pause for 20 seconds, and then the subjects are asked to recount as many numbers as they can. So if you're like an average performer, you would recall 7 to 9 numbers. With a little bit more pushing and training, you could go up to 14. And there was this one subject, for the purpose of the experiment, they called subject SF. And this guy was a guy who had average test scores. He was smart. His memory was average as tested on standardized tests. But this guy, with intensive training and practice was able to push his memory up to 82 digits. And obviously this happened over a 2-year period with 250 hours of intense, deliberate training. And then they were so impressed by this, they tried to recruit more subjects, and then they found a guy who could do 102 numbers or digits with more of that same coaching and training. However, this coaching and training was very intense mentally. I mean, it was so difficult that you could see that these people were perspiring, they were trying to recall the numbers, and it was just excruciating to watch them do that as they went through the process. And what they published in the article Science was that there is apparently no limit to improvement in memory skill with practice. And most of us who have children or have worked with small kids will probably see that as true. And what's the role of intelligence? We commonly talk about IQ, and that is a common recruiting tool for a lot of large companies. Google, Microsoft, they all use these IQ tools to weed potential recruits out. And IQ has been generally accepted as a general marker for intelligence. However, Daniel Goleman, earlier on in this, at the turn of the century, talked about EQ, or the emotional quotient, which comprised self-control, zeal, persistence, tolerance, and several other components to it as well. And Howard Gardner from Harvard talked about people who have multiple intelligences: linguistic, musical, spatial, etc. And then there was this interesting study, the references to which are noted below, a study that was done among people in the sales industry and people who did or professional horse betting. And the study results are very interesting. So this is a meta-analysis of people who worked in sales. So their bosses were asked to grade these employees, their junior salespeople, based on their intelligence. And then they looked at their productivity and how much sales they had done. And interestingly, though, the bosses, their employees that they had graded as being exceptionally smart and intelligent did not really have the highest sales. And similarly, when you looked at the study with the horse betting, it was very interesting to note that IQ in and of itself did not predict the odds at which someone predicted successfully which horse was going to win on a consecutive level. And the study was so interesting that it showed that a construction worker with an IQ of 82 actually did way better than a lawyer with an IQ of 25 who went to the race the same number of times and had the same degree of interest. So what was it that was happening that separated these people from being able to perform even though their IQ was not at the highest? And so their conclusion was IQ does not measure the ability to engage in cognitively complex forms of multivariate reasoning. And the sales study and the horse betting study showed that these people who performed really well were able to process mathematical models that were very complex in their head and therefore translate that into better outcomes, whether it was sales or horse betting. So that's really fascinating and really questions the dogma of what talent is or what the role of intelligence, memory, and experience is in the expert performers. And then, so what are the researched models of expert performance? You have sports, you have music, and you have chess. And these are commonly the cited sources for measuring expert performance, though today people have applied that to almost all forms of expert performance, whether it's business, finance, teaching, anything of that sort. So when you look at a sport, any sport, there are two components to achieving mastery in a sport. One is conditioning, and that would involve like an NFL linebacker going to the gym and working out 6 hours a day, or a swimmer being in the pool 4 hours a day. Then the rigorous diet, the exercise, all that follows as part of the conditioning. And then you have the specific skill. So for a golfer, his drive or his swing, for a batter or for a pitcher, their specific skill is what they need to practice. And how does it apply today to us as surgeons? The conditioning would be increasing maybe domain-specific knowledge, reading more articles, reading more papers, reading your textbook. And that applies whether you are an intern or whether you're an attending, increasing that conditioning or that domain knowledge. And the specific skill, obviously, for us is gained in the operating room. And this is applied widely across all sports models. The only difference, say, between the sport and the music model is that the sport model has a lot of changing dynamics. The opponents are changing, the weather is changing, the atmosphere is changing, and that's a little different from music, where the conditions are for the most part quite stagnant. You know what you're going to play ahead of time, you know who you're going to be playing it for, and that model can be applied to business presentations, speeches, evaluations, where you know ahead of time what you're going to be doing, who your target audience is, and you can practice to the point of being really good at it. If you look at chess players, when they study the game, they study positions that are opening positions, closing positions, defense positions, attack positions, and they're able to keep all that in their head so that when they get to the game, they're able to bring those pieces together to have a great game. And this was applied in the business model, first at Harvard, by their case series or their case analysis. And this has been a tremendous source of teaching young business graduates about the pitfalls of business, mistakes that have been made, and going forward and training them to do the best thing at that time. And interestingly, what the case model presents is that the subject would give their own response to the case and then measure that with what an expert had done, which had been shown to succeed. And that has proved to be a powerful tool for teaching and learning. So what are the lessons we learned from Tiger Woods? With his dad, he wrote a book called Training a Tiger. And the findings of that book are very interesting. So Tiger Woods was the son of Earl Woods after a second marriage. At the end of his first marriage, Earl Woods had retired. He had been in the Army previously, and he had trained and coached cadets. And he had also been a baseball teacher and had been very successful at it. When Tiger came along, Earl Woods was around 44. And at that time, he had also taken up golf with a passion and had actually reached scores that are equivalent to pros. So when Tiger came along, he was already in that mindset and that frame to be able to coach this youngster. And in fact, if you read the book, Tiger Woods got his first golf club at the age of 7 months, and he would be sitting in the high chair watching his dad swinging the ball, in the garage and hitting the ball in the garage. And he was taken to the golf course at 2 years, where he had been doing that till he turned pro at 19. So when you actually look at the data and look at Tiger Woods, he turned pro at 19, but for the last 17 years, he had been under the instruction of an expert, a coach, who was taking him through the rigors of what it meant to become an expert. So the talent hypothesis doesn't completely pan out when you look at his story. And what about Mozart? I mean, Tiger Woods was called the Mozart of golf. And what about Mozart? If you look at his story, again, there's very compelling evidence to suggest that the innate ability probably is not as strong as we think it is when we look at expert performance. So Mozart also grew up in a home that was very musically inclined. His father, Leopold Mozart, was an accomplished musician, a pianist and a violinist. And he got Mozart into playing the piano at the age of 2 years, teaching him at that time. And then by the age of 5, Mozart was composing his own music. But if you really look back at that, his dad was helping him, and his dad was correcting the mistakes that he was making at that time. So there was no real difference between Mozart at 5 and anybody else that you would imagine who was doing good music. By the age of 8, he was again performing solos. But again, if you look at the history, he had practiced for hours and hours on end. And if you look at his famous or less than famous compositions, you will find that they are actually rearrangements of music that was done under his mentor, Johann Sebastian Bach. So again, the talent hypothesis is not really panning out over here. And then finally, at the age of 19, he composed the Piano Concerto No. 9. And that was his first great masterpiece. But again, if you look at the way his music was composed, there was hundreds and hundreds of hours where he was rearranging the music, canceling things out, writing it again, rearranging it. And by the time his first grand masterpiece came out at the age of 19, he had been practicing for 17 years. So again, the talent hypothesis doesn't completely pan out. And what lessons can we learn from the Polgar sisters? So let me tell you a little bit about their story. Their father was Lazi Polgar, and he was a Hungarian psychologist. He was of the mindset that greatness is made, not born. And he actually set out to perform an experiment to prove it. He actually publicly requested for a woman to marry him with whom he could have kids and then prove that his theory was correct. So Clara Polgar, who was a Ukrainian, married him, and they had 3 daughters. The first daughter was Susan, the second daughter was Sophia, and the third daughter was Judith. From the age they were 4, they were indoctrinated into chess. Hours and hours of chess. Their study was filled with books about chess positions, memorizing chess games, chess positions, and it went on and on and on. There were flashcards. When they were not studying for school, they were studying chess. And it was no surprise that with 11 years of that kind of rigorous training, Susan Polgar became the first woman grand champion or grand master at the age of 21. And she was also the first woman to beat a male standing grand champion. And then if you look at Judith, who was the younger sister, with that same coaching, she became a grandmaster at the age of 15. And Sophia, who was the middle daughter, who actually showed the least interest or aptitude for that and probably practiced the least, became the 6th highest ranked woman chess player at the age of around 23. But this practice was so intense that when they hit their mid-20s, they said enough is enough. We're going to go and have families, get normal jobs, and that's what they did. So you would say that maybe the dad knew something about what he was doing. Though I don't agree with it, but he knew what he was doing. So what did these 3 people that I talked to you about, Tiger Woods, Mozart, and the Polgar sisters, what did they have in common with, say, Warren Buffett, who started his first news cycle runs at the age of 11 years, buying 2 pinball machines, planting them in a barbershop, gaining money from that, investing that in farmland, and generating more revenue, and the story goes on and on. What does he have in common with them? What about Itzhak Perlman, the world-famous violinist? And what about Shizuka Arakawa, who is the 2006 gold medalist ice skater who probably fell 20,000 times in practicing before she reached that gold medal? What about Michael DeBakey, who performed 60,000 operations, and I trained at the hospital that he worked at, so we heard a lot about DeBakey when we were training. But obviously, he didn't do 60,000 operations from skin to skin, but there was a lot of operations that he did in his lifetime. And what about Chris Rock? I mean, the stories go that when he gave his performances at Madison Square Garden in front of 20 people on New Year's Eve, he had practiced for that show for almost a year, giving reruns and practice shows at several bars and clubs in New Jersey. So what does that tell us? It tells us that expert performance is related to deliberate practice. So what exactly is deliberate practice? It is designed specifically to improve performance. It is usually with a teacher or a coach. It can be repeated a lot. Continuous feedback is constantly available. It is highly demanding mentally. And as surgeons, we know that, and I think attendings appreciate that more than residents. When the case is tough, you'll see the attendings are getting hot into the collar, they're perspiring, their scrubs are getting a little more wet with perspiration. The resident and the medical students have no clue. And I remember doing my first adrenal case with Dr. Nabnet, and the medical student told me that was a lot of fun. And when I was doing my first adrenal, I think the last thing I would describe it was fun. I was really stressed out doing it. So that's really what deliberate practice is, and that's really what's been consistently shown to separate the expert performers from the average performers. So I live on 110 and 5th Avenue, and I go to Braxton, the barbershop over there, to get my hair cut. And the guy who cuts my hair consistently, his name is Val Jones. And it's a cool sounding name, and this guy cuts hair for 3 days a week, and he also studies theater part-time at LaGuardia Community College. And so when he's not cutting hair, he's practicing to become a performer. And he told me about this time when he went on this road trip at, I think it was in Boston, and there was this big competition. And he was saying he had locked himself in a bathroom to be away from his colleagues and peers, and he was practicing for 6 hours locked up in the bathroom to get his part down perfectly. And so what he told me was, you've got to eat, breathe, and sleep at row, and he said it in the classic accent, which I couldn't imitate. So what about deliberate practice in surgery? We would agree that our residency and our fellowship are supposed to model that deliberate practice. As in Sinai, as in most other hospitals, we are incorporating low-fidelity and high-fidelity simulators. So what's a low-fidelity simulator? Something as simple as tying up hundreds of half hitches on your jump strings of your scrubs. That's a low-fidelity simulator. It works very well. What is high-fidelity simulation? If you use your computerized models like the GI Mentor, the Vascular Mentor, those are high-fidelity models that are used today. And when you look at simulators, you're trying to see different forms of validity to make these simulators valid. And you can have concurrent validity as to whether the exercise of the simulator is as good as what it says it is. Construct validity, whether the simulator is able to separate experts and novices. And predictive validity as to whether it can actually predict performance in real life. And there are different paces of learning, as we all know, and maturation. And there are examples of great surgeons in our field. Michael DeBakey, like I said, performed 60,000 operations. John Cameron, at least in the last few years, had performed the most number of Whipples than anyone else in the country. And we all would agree that surgeons are trained in the operating room. So I'm going to step back and change into a different gear in terms of talking about this thermal imaging as a tool for measuring skill and performance. So when you look at the acquisition of technical skills, the commonly cited model is the Fitz and Posner model of learning. And there are three phases of learning: cognitive, integrative, and autonomous. The cognitive phase of learning is associated with the novice, integrative with the intermediate phase of skill, and autonomous with the expert. So if you were to take even something simple as driving a car, to learning a dance, to doing an operation, all these skills fall under the same domain of cognitive, integrative, and autonomous. And the current metrics for procedural mastery are quite rudimentary, even though we may think otherwise. We base performance based on speed. We base it on accuracy. We base it on errors. And though by themselves are not bad, they're not perfect. And so there have been studies to develop new tools for validating performance. In the laparoscopic world, it's GOALS. That's Global Objective Assessment of Laparoscopic Skills. It was pioneered by Dr. Gerald Fried's group at McGill University. And the same group also started work on GAGES, which is the Global Assessment of Gastrointestinal Endoscopic Skills. And both these have been validated tools. And if you look at the stress response, all of us are faced with stress in our daily life. I mean, stress from getting married, stress to having a baby, stress to working in clinics, stress to working with employees, stress to being in the operating room. All of that is stress as we commonly use it. But stress is all not bad. If you look at this curve over here, the first part of the curve is performance actually improving with stress, and that's called eustress, or the good stress. And then you have performance which gets worse with stress that is continuously applied at a very high level for a high long time, and that's called distress. And that's usually what we are talking about when we say we're stressed, we're stressed, we're stressed. Effective stress quantification is actually elusive. EEGs over here, functional MRIs, electrodermal activity require the subjects to be strapped in, taped to invasive monitoring devices, and are not the best ways to study stress when the subject is already aware that he's being studied for stress. So therefore, we looked at thermal facial mapping as a novel method for stress quantification. Thermal imaging is not new. For all those of you who have an iPad, if you go to the photo booth app on your iPad, there's a thermal imaging photograph or a camera over there that generates the same image. So basically what this camera does is looks at the blood flow patterns, the heat intensity, and perspiration signals on the face of a subject. And the thermal imaging as a tool has been validated in lie detection exercises and mental exercises. So we said, can we apply this to motor tasks or motor skills? So our hypothesis was that acquiring a surgical skill is associated with a measurable level of stress, and that successful acquisition of the skill will be evidenced by diminution in stress. So here's the setup of our model. Here's an expert subject performing a validated laparoscopic task. Here is the computer programmer sitting and looking at the thermal imaging signal as well as the regular facial image. This is the thermal camera zoomed onto the patient's face. And the advantages of the thermal imaging system are that it's contact-free, it is continuous, it is potentially automatable, and it's procedure independent, so whether it means you're doing an endoscopic skill, laparoscopic skill, open skill, it's valid in all those frames of environment. So if you look at the facial map, there are three signals that you concentrate on. The upper signal over here is the periorbital signal, and we have shown that in moments of fight or flight, if there is an alarm, door shutting loudly, an alarm bell going off, the intensity of those signals in the periorbital areas go up. Then you have the supraorbital signal, and that's the signal that goes up when there's sustained stress, when someone is memorizing something, studying something. Those are the signals that go up. And then you have the maxillary signal, which is the area just above the upper lip, and that is the signal that shows the most change when someone is actually doing a task and learning a task. And over a course of time and over several forms of validation, we showed that this maxillary signal was the most specific in change when a person was acquiring a specific skill. And when I talk about the signal, I'm talking about the development of these perspiration beads that you can detect with the camera that you cannot necessarily see on the skin itself. So for our study design, we had 8 novices, 11 experienced subjects, and we divided them as being basic laparoscopic experience, those who are maybe like mid-level residents, and the advanced laparoscopic group, which was basically attendings trained with an MIS fellowship. The novices included junior residents and non-surgeons such as technical personnel as well as medical students. So we used 3 validated tasks. The first running string was developed by Butch Rosser at Yale and then subsequently incorporated in the UT Southwestern curriculum. And the pattern cut and the intracorporeal suture, as we all know, are part of the FLS curriculum. So the study design followed as depicted here. There were 5 sessions, 3 tasks per session, and 5 trials per task. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of data collected longitudinally over these sessions for these subjects. And then what we did was we correlated their perinasal perspiration signal. Remember, I mentioned that that was the most specific signal that changed when a subject was learning a task. And seen over here in this magnified image, you can see the perspiration beads developing on the maxillary area of the subject. It's like I said, it's not physical beads of perspiration. It's seen on the thermal imaging camera. And then we also correlated that with the standard metrics of time and errors, as we usually do for these tests. And then we also looked at the facial action coding system. You may not realize it, but we all do it when we're doing a task. There are certain facial patterns that we all do, but because with our mask covered, we don't really recognize that. So someone doing a task may, pucker their lip, lower their eyebrow, frown, and we don't realize it, but that's all related to different types of tasks that are being performed and the stress at which they're being performed under. So the expressions can be classified as positive, neutral, and negative, and we correlated the facts data with the standard metrics as well as the thermal imaging signals, and we performed an ANOVA analysis. So let me just exit over here to show you the video. So this is what I was talking about when the subject is doing a task. So, like I said, we don't realize it, but we're all doing it. So what do the results look like? As expected, the novices performed worse than the experienced subjects for task 1, which was the running string. They also performed poor compared to the subjects in task 2, the pattern cut, as well as task 3. And we would expect that. There was nothing ground-shattering or new in that. And again, when we looked at time, there was no significant difference between the different surgeon populations over time for task 1. Both the novice and experienced surgeons were meeting proficiency for task 2. Nothing really super that we learned from that. And experienced surgeons were also meeting proficiency time for task 3. However, novices were not. This was the intracorporeal suturing. And let me just exit over here because I was having a problem with the video. So this is the expert subject performing intracorporeal suturing. You will see that as time progresses, their thermal signature over the perimaxillary area is not really changing. And what about subject 2? This was the novice subject. If you look at his video over time, he's doing the same task. You can see that, I don't know how well it projects, but you can see these perspiration dots that are beginning to develop on his perimaxillary area, which was not clearly seen in the expert. And what did their thermal signature look like when they were doing the task? So if you looked at the novice surgeon doing their task, their signal, which is the signal captured from the thermal imaging camera and mathematically modified and using an algorithm to compute this data and compute the signal, if you see their signal over here, it's all over the place. It's up, it's down, peaks and valleys. And that was interesting data to see how their stress pattern correlated with their level of expertise. And if you looked at the experienced surgeon, their level of performance was almost a flat line, was the same through the course of the task. So the results of the thermal imaging were quite interesting. In all groups, facial maps showed stress if the performance was poor. The degree of stress related inversely to level of expertise, and the pattern cut, unlike what was originally thought to be the intracorporeal suturing, was the hardest task to perform without error, eliciting stress in novices, but not in experts, further differentiating masters. And something that we took away from this is when a novice subject makes an error, they're stressed out by it, and they actually start going faster to try to compensate for the error, and that actually leads to more error and a worse performance. If you look at an expert when they're doing the task, if they make a mistake, they actually slow down to correct the mistake before progressing and catching up on their speed and catching up on their flow of motion. So that was really interesting data that we picked up from the study. So in summary, I would say that thermal imaging seemed to identify the evolution and different patterns of stress in subjects engaged in a surgical task, and also that facial visual and thermal imaging as a surrogate for procedural competence appeared to separate subjects based on expertise. And we were able to, unfortunately, be able to publish this data in Nature a year and a half ago. So the conclusions from the talk, to summarize: talent, experience, memory, and intelligence are not the primary drivers of expert performance. I'm not saying that they don't have any role, but what we have done is to question those traditional models and see what role they really play in expert performance. And deliberate practice is the key to expert performance. We've seen that across the arena in sports, in music, in chess, as well as even in surgical expertise. Obviously, being a surgeon, there's the knowledge component, there's the judgment component, and the skills component. And like I said, as surgeons, it matures at different times, but deliberate practice is the key. And thermal imaging may be an important tool and a metric to characterize level of performance. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge that the research that we did was supported by the National Science Foundation, as well as Methodist Hospital where I trained, as well as the Department of Defense. And this was the stress-free team that helped to gather the data and put the study together. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.